feel is that we're so used to the quiet of Truro and part of the quiet of Provincetown, certainly the quiet of the National Seashore, and to have this huge machine with a long string of cars coming through, it was hard to figure out how that how you were in sync with the beauty and the quiet of the Outer Cape.
Think about the railroad this way. The first colonial census in Truro, probably in the 1700s, showed over 1,000 people. By 1840, Pamet Harbor was one of the busiest ports on the East Coast. There were 3 piers at Pamet Harbor, something like 63 fishing vessels tying up there. When the railroad came through in 1870, it was completed to Truro. It was built in stages along Cape Cod. First came over the bridge, then to Sandwich, blah, blah, then to Orleans. Finally, in 1872, it came before Truro Town Meeting, and the idea was to post a bond to cover the expenses of building the railroad. Truro Town Meeting refused to authorize a bond. So the railroad was paid for in Truro by private subscription. The haves, the richer people in town, put up the money to pay for building the railroad in Truro. One of the interests, I don't know who the laborers were, presumably some of the local people, but one of the stories that went around as the railroad was completed in Truro, a guy from Wellfleet took off with the payroll and nobody in Truro got paid that. They did catch the guy and they finally got paid. They didn't get paid on time. Originally 3 train stops, at South Truro, at Pamet, and in North Truro. Train station in South Truro was on the corner of Ryder Beach Road. The Pamet station was on the south side of the harbor, and in North Truro it was up at the top where Pond Village is. Up, again, the train was on the bay side. By 1900, the cottages at Corn Hill had become so popular that they put in a 4th station called the Flag Stop for those tourists.
You can't see it from the camera right now, but we're very close to the inside of the very sharp elbow of Cornhill Road at Cornhill Beach. So Castle Road is out there, and it comes in and takes that very sharp turn right there, and the parking lot for Cornhill Beach is over there. So we're actually standing on the rail bed. So if you look there past me, this is where the train went until 1938, 1940. The old Cornhill stop, which was actually the only real flag stop on the rail bed, was right here, about 30 feet back was where that was. And you know what a flag stop is? A flag stop is the train doesn't schedule to stop there. But if somebody needs to get on, they put the flag up and then the train knows to stop.
In terms of how long it took, basically it was from North Truro, it was about a 4-hour and 40-minute ride. That kind of changed. Sometimes it was a little bit over 5 hours, sometimes it was a little bit, it was maybe 4.5 hours, but that all depended on how many stops the train made, depended on weather, it depended on any sort of obstructions on the tracks. So that was, again, an amazing thing. In 4.5, 5 hours, you can be in Boston. So that was very important.
So in the early 1900s, my great-grandparents who lived in Dedham took the train from Dedham or Boston down here to the Pamet with my great-aunt Lucy, who was a little sickly, and they thought the sea air would help her. They got off at the train here and they walked up Depot Road to a house that they were renting right up the road here. They ended up buying that house and it's still in the family. That's how they first came to Truro, was by train.
The South Truro, the first station as you came from Wellfleet into Truro, was only 3 miles from Wellfleet. So they were very close together. The stations themselves were simple. They weren't, they were not elaborate. They had a waiting room, a ticket office, and a baggage room. And inside the ticket office was usually 2 long benches, a Seth Thomas clock, which is a typical railroad clock, a small penny gumball machine, and a potbelly stove. Those were the sort of the parts of it. So very simple. They also had fire extinguishers because it was sometimes possible where, again, they'd find, sparks or embers from the train. Certainly there were other products and wares that came into Truro and leaving Truro, but it was mostly, it enabled the fishing industry that was on the decline to be able to get their fish to market quicker and to more markets. So that was incredibly important for a dwindling fishing industry. There never was a finer looking uniform than that of the old colony passenger conductors, who wore a double-breasted frock coat with the gold monogram OCRR on the collar. The passenger train was a separate group, locomotive, passenger cars, and that was the passenger train. But it did carry, in terms of freight, it did carry the mail, which was again very important, and it also carried what they called express, which were packages. So it also became like the pre of UPS. I find cold storage just a fascinating place, and when you sit there, today, you really have to work on visualizing. It was a commercial center, and busy and probably stinky and everything else.
I'm not sure how they dealt with the ice, but in the 1840s, 1850s, what they do, go out and fish, and then they'd go right to Boston with their catch. It probably wasn't until the railroad came in that they were able to set up the cold storage for it. And when it all collapsed, the fishing industry just collapsed because the shallow draft boats couldn't compete with the big ones.
Even though I'm a very late riser now, when I was a small boy, I was a very early riser. And my grandmother used to take me out so that I wouldn't bother all the other family members from our house in South Truro. And we would go over to the trestle and pick dinner off of the trestle because it was covered with mussels. You probably remember them, Jan.
I do.
The mussels were good too.
Yeah.
So, we had a stop over near Ryder Beach, the one way down there. So that was the train stop that we saw, and I could see the train as a little boy. And I have a fond memory of when I was 3 years old. I was still forced to take naps. The house that we were on, which is on Ryder Beach Road now, that we were in rather, had it was a bowed cape, which is a house that's built out of ship timbers. So the second story is all these bowed ship timbers that go like this on the house. And my grandparents built a garage ultimately for all the 11 grandchildren to stay in. But when I was really little, they hadn't built the garage yet, so I had to sleep in the attic that was outside the bedroom upstairs under the bowed cape, and there was one window at the end. And when the train that came back from Provincetown in the afternoon came by, I would always run over to the window and go like this and hope the guy would see me to bring the air horn. And I have one fond memory of running out of the cot that I slept in and that I was supposed to be taking a nap in, and I could hear my mother downstairs, and she could hear me running, and she said, "Jay, get back in bed," because I was trying to talk to the train.
I heard the story when I was doing the research. Someone from the Nauset Railroad Club told me the story that the trestle bridge at Pamet was pretty rickety. And the crew was a little concerned because at this point it was just freight trains, so freight trains were pretty heavy. So what they did was that they came up to the bridge going over to Cornhill, and they would stop the train, put it on a very, very, very low speed. Some of the crew would cross the bridge by foot, get on the other side. They would start the train going very slowly. Those guys that were on the train would get off, let the train go, and then the crew on the other side would jump on the train to run it again. But it's a good visual. You can just see it.
There's at least one story about people accepting liquor deliveries, flagging the train down between South Truro and Pamet, and a box being unloaded. Imagine that. Well, the train couldn't gain speed if it's only 3 miles between things, so they're coming along at 10 miles an hour or something like that. Not much of a big deal to just even stop and just toss a box off. Truro was dry. You could put in a case marked dry goods or whatever, rifles, and it would be full of liquor. Major liquor production was up at Great Hollow. Joe Cabral had a stand on the highway. Supposedly the liquor was all buried in his asparagus patch. He was the local distiller.
Growing up, there was a bridge here, and there was a beach here. There's not much of a beach now, but there was quite a bit of a beach right below the railroad trestle. My grandmother brought us here all the time, taught us all to swim. First taught us how to float, then taught us to swim. And it was a very busy place right here, if you can imagine. It was quite a little beach with a lot of people here with their kids. The bridge and the railroad were a big part of life here. Everybody'd be down here hanging out, and then you'd hear the whistle, and all the mothers would say, "Get off the bridge," because the kids were all hanging out on the bridge, putting pennies up there to see if it would get the train to go off the tracks, or diving off the trestle. And then there was a big, uproar, "Get off the bridge, get away, here comes the train." And we'd all scamper down and go swimming again, and then it would happen again. So it was kind of a ritual, as was jumping off the bridge, which I did probably when I was about 15 or 16, but right before the bridge came down. It was scary, but it was, everybody was kind of daring you to do it. My older cousins were fanatics about it. They jumped off both sides of the bridge. One side of the bridge was taller than the other, and the whole big dare was to jump off the high side when the tide was going out, which meant you could get caught underneath the bridge if you weren't a really good swimmer. We used to sail little boats in this harbor too, which is also hard to imagine now because it's so filled with pleasure boats. But at that time in the late 50s, early 60s, we used to race little 10-foot sprites, fiberglass sprites, and one of the big issues was whether we would crash into the bridge or not. So if the wind was coming the certain way, this way, and the tide was coming in, and we were down here by the bridge, we would often get tangled up in it. Over here is a house and a barn that belonged to my great-uncle Bill. It still belongs to his descendants. It was painted by Edward Hopper, who did a number of paintings in Truro, and quite a few specifically of the railroad.
It's very fascinating to me how many times he painted the railroad or referenced it very specifically. And it's not that he has actually drawn the rails as much as he's drawn the environment. I think that there are 13 of this, and I believe that this is an urban painter who came to the Cape to rest and relax and needed to find something to paint because he was a painter. He was looking for something urban, something commercial. And what do we have in South Truro? We have the train and we have the cold storage plant. And that, my friends, is the end of the story for commercial in South Truro and in North Truro. My favorite one is actually the coal box. That's my favorite painting, and I don't quite know why, but it's just evocative of the peacefulness and the blue sky and the marsh and the things that you love if you've grown up in the Truro area.
Train stopped because of the automobile. And for the freight, it was the trucks. And you could not compete with once the car became affordable to the middle class, that's the way, that took over. And the train, the railroad could not afford to compete with both the trucks, buses, and cars. And as the train brought the hospitality economy to the Outer Cape, it was the car that basically brought all the different cottage colonies to the Outer Cape.
As they built Route 6 in 1952, suddenly you had 4 lanes. Trucks could speed through the town to make deliveries.
You also had a couple of other important factors. One, weekends workers having Saturday and Sunday off became ingrained into the economy. So people could go get in a car and go away for the weekend. Very important. The other thing is the 1956 National Highway Act. So with all the money going into roads, highways, interstates, the trains, and they still, they don't really are able to compete.
I was here when it was removed in 1962. My dad had us here, and the railroad was being removed. And I think I was in college in 1962, and he said, you have to go over to Pamet Harbor because they're removing the last of the trestle today. I said, really? And he said, yeah. And so I came over, and there was a derrick on the back end of a flat car, and it was taking up the railroad ties and the railroad rails.
Yeah.
And it was heartbreaking to me because it was the end of such an era.
Very often the question is, will the train come back? And the answer is most likely no. And it's a shame because they now have some very efficient, lightweight train cars. But my feeling is you could never get the environmental permits you would need. You'd have to go through, even if you lined it up with Route 6, you'd still have to, go through people wouldn't put up with bringing the train back, not in their backyard or their front yard. So but it's a shame. They do run summer trains from Boston into Hyannis, but it would be great to think of yourself, reading a book rather than sitting in the traffic, going over, waiting to get over the bridges. But that's the reality of our culture as a car culture.